Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Emanation Extreme. This is one of two extreme primals available in Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood. This video will assume you have basic knowledge of the encounter on normal mode and will instead focus on the changes to the extreme mode difficulty. If you'd like a more in-depth look at the encounter, please visit the written guide in the description below. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your primal guide. The biggest change to the encounter is the use and refilling of Vril. On extreme mode, each player has 3 uses of Vril before it's depleted, and there are very specific times during the encounter when players have the opportunity to replenish their stacks. As such, players will need to carefully use their Vril throughout the encounter. To begin the fight, each tank will grab one of the adds to avoid cleaving everyone with Tail Slap, while the rest of the group focuses one down. Players will need to avoid the gaze attack inner demons by either turning away or moving completely out of range of the attack. I would recommend focusing one add down before they get healed by Lakshmi's first Stotram attack, as this will save you precious time. Once both adds are destroyed, Lakshmi will become targetable and the true fight begins. Hand of Grace works in the same manner as normal mode, but 3 players will be targeted for the attack. There are a variety of ways to spread each marker, so handle these in a manner that's comfortable for your group. The only recommendation I would give on specific positioning is to ensure that no marked player is near melee range on the assigned side of the boss. The off-tank or the second threat target will be baiting the Path of Light attack. These 2 attacks can overlap, and if a marked player is too close, they might get hit by both and die. While the 3 Hand of Grace players position themselves, everyone else will need to ensure they're in the appropriate safe zones. During this time, the main tank will need to watch for the first tank buster, the Pull of Light. Cool down and heal through this as necessary. Next up, another Stotram. This deals a high amount of raid damage, and healers will need to top everyone off as quickly as possible. Another tank buster, and then the off-tank or second enemy target will be targeted for the Path of Light with this blue marker. Bait that in the assigned spot to avoid cleaving everyone. Up next, Alluring Arm will have 3 players dealing with markers and their respective AoEs. 1 player will have the cross, and 2 players will have the puddles. Spread these as necessary. These are immediately followed by another tank buster and another Stotram. Next up, players will need to stack to share the damage of the Pall of Light. Another tank buster, and then the first Chanchala cast. On extreme mode, this cast will cause all of her attacks to be stronger and have an additional effect to them, as well as introducing new divine attacks. A good rule to remember is that anytime Lakshmi is glowing dark like this, you should probably be ready to use Vril. The first ability she'll cast in this form is Divine Denial, which will knock off any players that do not use Vril. Remember that even with the use of Vril, you'll still be knocked back a few yalms, so be sure not to be standing on the edge of the platform. Hand of Beauty will mark up the 2 healers for puddles, and in this form, the puddles will grow over time and place the heavy on each healer. To avoid getting heavied and getting stuck in the puddle, the marked players should use a Vril before the puddle drops, allowing them to run out before it begins to grow. At the same time, the main tank will be targeted for another tank buster. Tank busters in Chanchala form do a ton of damage, and the main tank should use a Vril to reduce that damage. The off-tank or second on threat will then be targeted for another Path of Light. The damage of this attack is deadly in this form, and they will need to use a Vril to avoid death. Other players need to be especially careful not to get caught in this cone attack either, or they too will die. The boss will then move to the center again and cast Divine Desire. Players will need to pop Vril here to avoid getting seduced and forced into the AoE bleed around Lakshmi. Even with Vril, this ability will pull you into the center a few yalms, so make sure you're not too close to the puddle. After this cast, Lakshmi will lose her dark form and her normal attacks will resume. Good thing too, as you may be running dangerously low on Vril. You'll see 1 more tank buster, another Path of Light on the second target, and 1 more Stotram before the add phase begins. 4 dreaming adds will spawn around the room. At any time during this phase, one of the adds will have a Vril bubble which will cause them to take reduced damage. If an add is destroyed and the Vril bubble jumps to them, it will revive them. A Vril bubble lasts 10 seconds before it jumps to its next target. Anytime an add with active Vril is destroyed, 2 players in the group will have their Vril stores replenished. The goal of this phase is to ensure that all players have Vril before Alluring Embrace. Lakshmi's ultimate is cast or they will die. An easy way to do this is to bring down all the adds to about 15 to 20% health. Then, once all the adds can be easily destroyed, kill the add affected by Vril, and all players should have their Vril in no time. During this phase, players targeted by these orange markers will need to spread away from others to avoid splashing water 3 damage. This phase will continue until Lakshmi's Alluring Embrace gauge counts down to 0, or all players have their Vril replenished. Players need to pop a Vril here to survive through her ultimate. Lakshmi will cast Chanchala as soon as she comes out of her ultimate animation, so be ready with that Vril. She'll move to the center and cast Divine Doubt, which will confuse all players for 16 seconds, forcing them to attack one another. another. Using Vril here will reduce the length of time a player is confused by half, and all players are advised to do so. I would also recommend spreading out in groups of 2 during this time. Confusion will force you to target the person closest to you, and doing this can ensure that one player isn't teamed up on and murdered. Path of Light is next, and the marked player will need to pop a Vril to survive it. The main tank will also need to pop a Vril for the upcoming Tank Buster. Here, Lakshmi will drop her dark form. Anytime she glows gold, Lakshmi will call down Vril bubbles in various AoE patterns. These will give players the opportunity to refresh their Vril stacks by popping bubbles. These yellow AoE patterns will deal damage, and players must ensure they do not linger in them while they're seeking bubbles. Fun fact, if you have an active Vril bubble up, the gold AoE markers will actually heal you instead of damaging you. Players will need to replenish Vril as necessary and be ready with a full stack before the next Chantula form. This first AoE pattern is a Z. The main tank will need to survive a Tank Buster during this time. The second AoE will cut across the center of the room in one straight line, and the off tank will need to handle Path of Light as per usual. Immediately after, players will need to stack in to share the damage of the Pall of Light. Next up, an Alluring Arm, and 2 players will need to deal with the cross while 1 player deals with the puddle. Another Path of Light on the off tank, and 1 more raid-wide Statram before Lakshmi enters her next Chantula form. This is where things can get a little bit spicy. We begin with Divine Doubt. All players will spread out and pop a Vril to minimize its effects. Immediately after, players will need to stack for the Pall of Light. In this form, the Pall of Light will place a bleed debuff on any player it hits. To avoid this, any player stacking in will need to use a Vril to avoid the debuff. Next, the third pattern of Vril AoEs will spawn in a ring around the outer edge of the platform. Players can and should replenish their Vril here. Lakshmi will move to the center and cast Divine Desire at the same time. Standing at the edge of the outer AoE telegraph and popping your Vril will allow you to avoid both effects. The fourth and last pattern of Vril AoEs is the same Z pattern as the first. At the exact same time, the Pall of Light will force a stack up of players. Remember to pop a Vril here to avoid the bleed. Next up is Statram. This will do insane raid-wide damage and will kill anyone with the bleed debuff or low health. Every player needs to pop a Vril to survive this attack, and healers need to be ready to top everyone off. Lakshmi will lose her Chantula form here, and the fight continues with an Alluring Arm. The marked players will spread appropriately while everyone else stacks for the incoming Pall of Light. The off tank will need to be ready to move the Path of Light marker away from others directly after. At this point, if you haven't killed her yet, the same mechanics will repeat. The next Chantula form is essentially a soften range, as most players will be out of Vril at this time. Eventually, she'll hard enrage and cast a continuous Divine Denial, knocking off all players and ending the fight. However, if players use their Vril at the appropriate times earlier in the fight, you should have ample raid damage to destroy her before any of this happens. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you in Omega. Till next time.